Good evening, everyone. My name is Karen DiMiola, and I serve as the Assistant Dean for Enrollment, Finance, and Administration at UConn Law School. I'm also a past president of the Connecticut Bar Association and a board member of the Connecticut Bar Foundation. Tonight, it is my pleasure to welcome you to the next Constance Baker Motley series on racial inequality. Tonight, we're going to talk about the results and the recommendations from the CBA Policing Task Force. The Constance Baker Motley Speaker Series on Racial Inequality was established by the Connecticut Bar Association and the Connecticut Bar Foundation. Judge Tejas Bhatt, Attorney Ron Hood, and myself have the privilege and honor of serving as this year's co-chairs for this Constance Baker Motley series. We take over from Attorney Vanessa Avery, Attorney Cecil Thomas, and Judge Barry Armada, and we are all honored to do so. And we look forward to continuing to explore topics related to racial inequality. Constance Baker Motley was a trailblazing civil rights attorney who became the nation's first African-American female to serve as a federal judge and later chief judge. Judge Motley was born in New Haven, Connecticut, and maintained strong connections to Connecticut throughout her life. Today's session on the Connecticut Policing Task Force is instrumental in the future. Constance Baker Motley was dedicated to civil rights and opportunity. She obviously did a lot of work with Brown, wrote the brief for Brown versus Board of Education, and was dedicated to ensuring that, in particular, minority students had access and opportunity to education. A quote that has stuck with me throughout my time as an attorney is the following by the Honorable Constance Baker Motley. The struggle for racial equality is like a prairie fire. You may succeed in stamping out the struggle for equality in one corner, and lo and behold, it appears soon after somewhere else. It is amazing to think about where we were when she was an attorney and where we are today, and the life lessons and her work continues. There are many of us who look to Constance Baker Motley as a beacon, as a mentor, even those of us who never met her, but she certainly has guided me throughout my career. Before we begin, I ask that you all view the chat function for this session's CLE codes and link to record the codes. We'll be sure that the codes are read aloud and posted in the chat during the presentation. Additionally, at the close of the session, we hope you will provide feedback on today's presentation using the survey provided in the chat. It is my distinct pleasure to welcome Cecil Thomas, who's the current president of the Connecticut Bar Association, an attorney at Greater Hartford Legal Aid, and as I mentioned, the co-chair for the first series of the Constance Baker Motley series. Cecil.
Thank you, Karen. Good evening. It's my pleasure to share a few words with you about the work of the CBA Policing Task Force as president of the Connecticut Bar Association. Article 2 of the CBA Constitution details our multifaceted organizational mission. The purposes of this association, it opens, shall be to promote the public interest through the advancement of justice and the protection of liberty. The opening of the Connecticut Rules of Professional Conduct remind us that a lawyer, as a member of the legal profession, is a representative of clients, an officer of the legal system, and a public citizen having special responsibility for the quality of justice. The CBA Policing Task Force, the work that it completed, and the report that it has produced is a profound example of these calls to action. CBA Policing Task Force was formed by former CBA president and my friend, the Honorable Judge Ndidi Moses, at the end of the 2019-2020 bar year. Immediate past president Amy Lynn Meyerson and I have been proud to continue to support the work of the task force, now spanning almost 18 months under the capable leadership of Attorney Deirdre Daly, Reverend Keith King, and Attorney Alexis Smith. I was proud to serve as a member of the task force, attended virtually every meeting, and served on one of the subcommittees. In this way, I was able to bear witness to the environment that was fostered within the task force. The task force brought together stakeholders from every point of engagement with the important issue of policing in our society today. Members of the community, law enforcement, faith leaders, lawyers of various backgrounds, academics and researchers, among many other key stakeholders. There were hard conversations and deep explorations of the pain, trauma, and historic and present injustice of police violence in the communities of color. There were also a great deal of empathy and understanding and a genuine expression of commitment from law enforcement and from so many others to advance meaningful solutions. Each member of the task force left with a deeper understanding of the issues. Every member of the task force worked together to advance a culture of mutual respect, understanding, and empathy within the group. Many of us entered the task force as strangers, perhaps wary of each other initially. I believe I can say that we leave the task force as friends and colleagues, mutually committed to continue to advance justice in its deepest and most profound sense. I'm also thrilled that this presentation is occurring within the Constance Baker Motley Speaker Series, which represents yet another powerful collaboration between the Connecticut Bar Association and the Connecticut Bar Foundation. To echo past President Stemiola's remarks, I believe Judge Motley would be proud of the work of the task force, but more importantly, I believe she would have been proud of the environment that was created within the task force to bring forward the thoughtful and comprehensive recommendations that will be presented to you tonight. Of course, our own dear Dr. Amani Edwards, CBA Director of Diversity and Human Resources, was deeply involved in the work of the task force, which draws upon her own area of study and area of expertise. It is my pleasure to turn it over to her now to speak further on the task force and its work.
Thank you, Cecil, and welcome everyone to the session tonight. It is a pleasure to be here. I have a few brief remarks about my time working with this task force, and then we will begin the presentation. Since June of 2021, I've had the pleasure with working with the members of the policing task force. As a CBA staff member, I had the pleasure of attending every task force meeting, including at least 4 weekly subcommittee meetings. During this time, I have listened to the task force members engage in thoughtful, uncomfortable, and collaborative dialogue. While some of the conversations were intense, often lasting weeks at a time, one thing was for certain: this task force was focused on uplifting and empowering communities and people. The blood, sweat, and tears and time put into the recommendations that will be presented here tonight are indicative of everyone's time, talent, and expertise, and also passion for these issues. The focus on community and people can be found throughout the recommendations presented this evening, and it is a pleasure to have attended and been a part of this whole process and to see the progress that will be presented here tonight. I want to thank the task force and subcommittee members for their commitment to this issue and hope you all enjoy the session this evening. I will now pass it on to one of the co-chairs of the Policing Task Force, Attorney Deirdre Daly.
Thank you, Amani and Cecil, for those beautiful words and for all your support during this process. But for you, we would not be here. I'd also like to give a shout out to Ndidi Moses, who called me 18 months ago and asked if I would help in this process, and I leaped at the opportunity. And so to this day, I very much appreciate her reaching out to me. So I'm going to give everybody a little bit of background here, and then everyone on this call is going to have an opportunity to speak. So I'm really your introducer. So I'm going to start by telling you a little bit about who we are. So we're 22 task force members. There were 14 other individuals who joined our committees and did invaluable work. We divided ourselves into 4 committees, and we were formed in the wake of George Floyd's death in June of 2020. The task force met almost weekly for the past 18 months, and the committees often also met weekly. So it's been a long haul, and we're very happy to be releasing the report and our 23 recommendations, which reflect our work at this time. As others have already noted, our strength was really in our diversity of perspective, and our diversity of life experience. The other thing I'd like to applaud, which Cecil mentioned, as did Amani, is the civility of our discourse. Our discussions were always robust and candid, and sometimes quite emotional. People have strong and sometimes opposing views, but the conversations were always respectful. And I, for one, learned a tremendous amount from my colleagues. I'm very grateful for the time and effort this group of 36 people dedicated to what I believe is meaningful and very important work. And to give you just a little bit of a sense of our individual backgrounds, I was the U.S. Attorney in Connecticut under the Obama administration earlier in my career as a federal prosecutor in New York, and I've spent many years in private practice as a defense attorney. I currently work at Finn-Dixon and Hurling in Stamford, Connecticut. I'm the mother of 3 young men, older now. One of them's an attorney, and I have lived almost all my life in Connecticut. Reverend Keith King, who you're going to hear from shortly, is the Reverend of the Christian Tabernacle Baptist Church in New Haven. He was formerly a federal prosecutor. He too is the father of 3, and 2 of them are attorneys. And he's also a former Marine. Alexis, you're also going to hear from Alexis Smith, who's currently the executive director of the New Haven Legal Assistance. She formerly worked at Hartford Legal Aid for a number of years. She is also the mother of 3 and has spent most of her life in Connecticut. It's been my great honor to work with both of them. Also in our group, there were a number of community organizers and activists. Dory Dumas, who you're going to also hear from, is the president of the New Haven NAACP. We had a youth advocate, diversity, equity, and inclusion trainer for judicial employees, leaders of the Community Foundation of New Haven, and a Connecticut Parents Union. We also had leaders from the CBA. Cecil was a continual presence and source of strength and wisdom throughout the process. We also had representatives from all the CBA affinity bars, and also attorneys of all stripes throughout the state, public defenders, current and former federal prosecutors, lawyers from major cities and small towns. We also had a number of members of law enforcement, the chief state's attorney, 2 current chiefs. One is Keith Mello, who is with us tonight, an FBI representative, former police officers, and a police union advocate. We also had a Superior Court judge and the Associate Attorney General. We also had a number of academics. Ken Barone, who you're going to hear from shortly after me, is now with UConn and was enormous help in this process. We also relied on a number of PhD students and a professor from Yale. So that gets you a sense of who we are and the diversity of our perspectives and experiences. I also wanted to speak a little bit about what we tried to do. We wanted to be practical, and our goal was to come up with practical recommendations. We shared our recommendations throughout the process with the legislative task force that is focused on police accountability, so that the work that we'd done could be addressed in a timely way. And a number of our recommendations were adopted by the Connecticut legislature. And before I talk any further, I just want to make one basic point that's very important to me, which is that we recognize that policing is a tremendously difficult job, particularly now at this time in our country. Violent crime is up, and the morale in police departments is very low. Good people are leaving the force, and it's very hard to recruit new candidates. And I'm hoping that Chief Mello will speak to this a bit. We have many dedicated officers in Connecticut, and we're fortunate to have many strong police leaders, some of whom are nationally recognized for their progressive leadership. We are not here to undermine their work, but we're hopefully here to encourage additional positive change, which we believe is needed to improve relations between the police and the people that they serve. In terms of how we did our work, we divided into 4 committees. I chaired the data collection committee, and I'm going to speak about that in a moment, and then Ken will elaborate on our work. But I want to mention the 3 other committees. The second committee was a police oversight committee, which examined how police departments, local communities, and state governments resolve allegations of systemic and individual instances of police misconduct. This group looked at internal affairs divisions, civil review boards, hiring practices, consent decrees, and pattern or practice lawsuits. They also evaluated police accreditation standards, and they made a number of valuable recommendations. And Dory Dumas was one of the co-chairs of this committee, and she will also be speaking with you shortly. Third committee was Moral Recognition, which was chaired by Alexis, my co-chair. And this committee focused on the recognition that often there is distrust in the police with deep historical roots among African Americans, other people of color, and their communities. The recommendations that this committee provided relate to steps that can be taken to address that mistrust and hopefully strengthen police community relationships through reconciliation initiatives, diversity, equity, and inclusion trainings, and community conversations. The fourth committee was Reimagining Police, which was led by the Reverend Keith King. And it examined the appropriate scope of police responsibility, considered calls for deploying alternative responders and related support, and examined relevant police training and policies. It also explored redefining public safety and combating systemic inequality by investing in programs that address the root causes of violence and crime. So now I'm just going to spend a few minutes talking about the Data Collection Committee. This committee reviewed in detail the approximately 86 incidents since 2001 in which Connecticut police officers and state troopers used deadly force. We relied on the information contained in public investigative reports prepared by state's attorneys. These reports focus on whether the use of the physical force by the officer violated state law. And in almost all incidents, there was a finding that the use of force was justified under state law. But we wanted to look at these incidents more deeply. Even if they were not a violation of law, what information can we cull from this incidents and what can we learn from them? With Ken's invaluable help, we prepared a comprehensive public database that documents the critical facts relating to these incidents. Why did we do this? There is a dearth of information regarding police deadly force incidents nationwide. We believe there's never been an effort to collect this information in the way we've collected it in Connecticut before. And there's a need to synthesize and publicly share this information in order to have a meaningful assessment of police work. And I'm going to conclude before I turn it over to Ken with two takeaways. The first is our committee made a number of recommendations, recommendation 1 through 5, for the recently appointed Inspector General, who will be the one to conduct these investigations of deadly force incidents in Connecticut going forward. We hope that he will consider these recommendations as he takes on this important work. And we also hope that he will maintain the public database that we have created. My second point is this. The data has showed over the last 20 years, almost half of the deadly force incidents involve people struggling with mental health conditions. Police responding to these incidents report that 46% of the incidents involve people who were emotionally disturbed, in mental distress, and/or deemed suicidal. Our strong recommendation here is that this data calls out for municipalities and police departments to seriously consider the role that mobile crisis units or other social services can play in supporting responses to these police calls. And we know that this is already happening in a number of corners of Connecticut. Our point is the police cannot manage these mental health emergencies on their own. Mental health experts may be best suited to help de-escalate these calls for help that too often have ended in deadly force. And our recommendations 20, if you're interested in this issue particularly, our recommendations 20 and 22 reflect our much more detailed thinking on this point. So I'm happy to answer any questions anyone might have at this time. but I would otherwise turn it over to Ken, who will elaborate further on the work of the Data Collection Committee.
Thank you, Deirdre. Good evening, everyone. It's been a pleasure to work with so many thoughtful people over the course of the last 18 months. One of the primary tasks that the Data Collection Committee set out to undertake almost 18 months ago was creating a database of use of deadly force incidents here in the state of Connecticut. So as Deirdre pointed out, there are reports on every incident of deadly force that have been published by the Chief State's Attorney's Office dating back to 2001. And those reports are lengthy and detailed, as they should be, but from the purposes of understanding patterns and practices from historical trends from data, it had been hard to do unless you spent a lot of time really reading and understanding each incident. And so we set out to create, to devise a team of individuals who would read every single incident report and all the subsequent material posted on the website for the purposes of developing a universal data set that would be available to the public, and that would also help to shape some of our recommendations as we considered our work. And so what I thought I would spend about 10 minutes doing today is simply walking you through some of the highlights from the data set that we compiled. The full data set can be found on the CBA Policing Task Force website, where the report is. I believe Tom put it in the chat. And so you are welcome to download the data set. And as Deirdre indicated, one of our recommendations was that in addition to publishing detailed reports on each incident, we are also encouraging the Inspector General to maintain a data set like this on their website and update it annually as new incidents occur. So I'm going to share my screen briefly. So in total, we reviewed 86 deadly use of force incidents that were investigated by the Division of Criminal Justice between 2001 and 2020. Investigations until recently were conducted by a state's attorney, and we reviewed the reports that were published by the state's attorney in each case. At the time of our work, 79 incidents had been reviewed, and the review had been completed by the Division of Criminal Justice. 7 incidents were still under investigation, but we were able to review preliminary reports and preliminary information provided by the Division of Criminal Justice. Of the 86 incidents we reviewed, death resulted in 76 of those cases. And we ultimately developed a database, gathered uniform information from each report, including incident information, subject/victim information, officer information, and investigative information. Just as some background, there's 94 municipal police departments in the state of Connecticut, 13 special agencies. The state police patrol close to 80 towns in the state of Connecticut. There are approximately 7,000 municipal officers and almost 1,000 state police troopers here in the state. Between 2001 and 2015, the state's attorney in the judicial district where the use of deadly force incident occurred was responsible for the investigation. And so they conducted an investigation whenever a peace officer in the performance of his or her duties used deadly physical force on someone and death resulted. In 2015, the General Assembly made changes to the law and investigations at that time needed to be completed when an officer used any type of force, physical force, and death resulted. And they also required the chief state's attorney to designate a prosecutor from another judicial district or a special state's attorney or special deputy state's attorney to investigate the incident. Public Act 1990 made further changes to the law. DCJ needed to investigate and determine the appropriateness of an officer's use of deadly force on another person when done in the performance of his or her duties. And so the big change in 2019 is death no longer needed to result in order to prompt an investigation. And so since that time, there had been 5 investigations when we completed our work. At least, I'm sorry, in 2019, there had been 5 investigations after this law took effect that were conducted, but death did not result on the part of the subject. To date, there have been 36 municipal police departments since 2001 involved in a deadly use of force incident, the Connecticut State Police, and also the Capital Region Emergency Services Team. 21 municipal police departments have only ever been involved in 1 deadly force incident. 6 municipal departments were involved in 2 deadly force incidents. 6 have been involved in 3 deadly force incidents, and only 5 departments have been involved in more than 3 deadly force incidents in Connecticut. I'm going to, just for the purposes of time, just move through. That's the list by departments. Departments that have more than 150 officers account for 51% of all deadly use of force incidents over the course of the last 20 years. Bridgeport had 7, Connecticut State Police 11, Hartford 13, New Britain and New Haven 3 each, Waterbury 4. Only 5 departments account for, again, also 51% of all the deadly force incidents. It's actually 6 departments, the top, because New London and Waterbury both had 4 each. But again, Bridgeport has had 7 in the last 20 years. By way of background, the Connecticut State Police, remember, there are 11 troops, 1,000 officers. They also include constables and resident troopers. Constables are under the jurisdiction of state police, but they are not necessarily state troopers. And so a number of these incidents involved a constable as part of a resident trooper program using deadly force. So just important context, Hartford 5, East Hartford 5, Hartford 13, New London and Waterbury each had 4 incidents. You can see deadly use of force by year. It sort of varies. We saw the greatest number of deadly use of force incidents in 2013. You start to see, if you look at 19 and 20, it appears as though deadly force incidents are increasing. It's really important to know that that is not necessarily the case. What sparks an investigation has changed in 2019, and a number of the incidents being investigated both in 19 and 20 again would not have met the definition of sparking an investigation prior to that. So just some important context there. We found that deadly force occurs most frequently between the hours of 4 and 10 p.m. So that's where we've seen the most number of incidences on that second shift. Subjects or the victims of deadly use of force incident by race and ethnicity, 44% were white, non-Hispanic, 30% were Black, non-Hispanic. Only 1 individual was Asian Pacific Islander, 21% were Hispanic, 3% the race was unknown. The reports in recent years have gotten much better at identifying demographic information on individuals involved in these cases, which was not necessarily the case prior to that. And we just make a note here that incidents occurred in 36 of 169 towns. And although population percentages in terms of the state demographics might be interesting, they could be a little bit misleading. So although 75% of the state is white non-Hispanic and 44% of the incidents involve white non-Hispanic, just again refer to, we know that 6 agencies make up 51% of these incidents. By gender, all of the individuals involved except for 1 were male. By age, again, 5% of the individuals, 4 individuals under the age of 18 have been involved in a deadly force incident. 19% or 16 individuals between the age of 19 and 25. 10 were between the age of 26 and 30. 16 between the ages of 31, and 40. And you can see down the list, and there were 17 individuals whose age we could not identify. We were able to determine the activity in categories that led to the incident. The vast majority of incidents were reported as a crime in progress. And again, multiple activities could be occurring at the same time. But you see a high share of incidents were a crime in progress, and also an emotionally disturbed person made up almost 46% of all of the individuals involved in force. 38% were under the influence. 27% were involved in a domestic disturbance, 30% in a disturbance, 14% in a traffic stop, and almost 25% were identified as a suspicious person, which sparked the incident. Armed versus unarmed subjects, 67 of the individuals that we looked at were armed, 34 were armed with a firearm. 30 only had a firearm, so 4 people had a firearm plus an additional weapon. 27 were armed with an edged weapon. 25 of those individuals only had an edged weapon. Edged weapon typically was a knife, but not always. 5 individuals were armed with a blunt instrument. Only 2 of those individuals were only had a blunt instrument, meaning the other 3 also had something else. 9 individuals were armed with something else. 4 had the vehicle was considered a weapon. In one case, there was a taser, a BB gun, 1 axe, 1 screwdriver, 1 bat, and 18 individuals were unarmed. We did spend some time focusing on the 18 unarmed individuals. Of the unarmed individuals, 6 were white, or 16%, 7 were black, non-Hispanic, or almost 30%, and 5 were Hispanic, or 30% of the unarmed subjects. Additional highlights that we point out from the unarmed subjects, incidents where the officer believed the subject had a weapon were 5. There were 8 incidents involved a vehicle or a police pursuit. 7 incidents of the 86 involved a subject that was considered mentally unstable. Again, these are just of the 18 unarmed subjects. So again, of the unarmed subjects, police believed that the individual had a weapon in 5 cases. 8 of them were the result of a police pursuit. 7, the officer identified the individual in clear mental distress. 6, the officer believed the individual to be under the influence of alcohol or drugs. In 5 cases, the incident involved the officer using a taser and no firearm. So there were 5 incidents in the state of Connecticut where an individual died as a result of a taser usage and not a firearm on the part of law enforcement. Incidents determined to be an inappropriate use of deadly force or charges filed. There were 3 in the history of the past 20 or so years. Of the 86 incidents, charges were filed in 3 cases. 1 in 2015 was a case of a Hartford police officer, and there were 2 incidents in 2019. 1 involving an incident with the Hamden Police Department, and 1 involving a corrections officer at, I believe, the New Haven prison. Some additional highlights from unarmed subjects. The number of investigations involving unarmed subjects has increased in recent years. So 4 of the 6 incidents in 2019 involved an unarmed subject. And that, again, is likely a result of the change in definition in terms of what sparks an investigation. And 2 of those were cases that resulted in the criminal charge, the Hamden and correction officer case. 2 of 7 cases that occurred in 2020 also involved an unarmed subject, and also involved an unarmed subject. Increases in cases involving unarmed subjects, again, appears to be a result of the statutory change in 2019 for what sparks an investigation. Departments involved in incidents with unarmed subjects, again, Brantford has been involved in 1. The Crest team was involved in 1. Cromwell 1. East Hartford 3. Hamden 1. Hartford 3. New Britain 1. New Haven Corrections 1. New London 2. Norwich 1. Waterbury 1. Wethersfield 2. So East Hartford, Hartford, New London, and Wethersfield were the only ones involved in more than 1 case where the subject was unarmed. Back to all subjects, we were able to track the control methods that were used by officers. In almost all cases, police reported first trying to use verbal commands, but in very few cases did you see a pressure hold. A chokehold or neck restraint was used in 0 cases. In 11 cases, there's a takedown, OC spray in 5 cases. You can see in 15 cases, police tried to use a taser. A canine was used in 9 cases, but a firearm was used in 80 of the 86 cases. 6 incidents resulted in death resulting from an electronic defense weapon deployment. I'm wrapping up. Some other notable highlights, I know Deirdre touched on this, notable highlights that we found in the data, almost half, 37 of the individuals were involved in a deadly use of force incident were identified by police as emotionally disturbed or a mental health crisis. 18 individuals were determined to be suicidal. 15 of these individuals were also identified as emotionally disturbed, so there is some overlap. 22 incidents, or 26%, of deadly use of force incidents resulted from or involved a motor vehicle, typically a pursuit. 31 individuals, or 37% of the incidents, were individuals that were under the influence or determined to be under the influence of alcohol and/or drugs. And of those individuals, 13 were also identified as emotionally disturbed. Ultimately, we identified 267 police officers involved in the 86 incidents. Of those where we were able to determine race, 84% were white, 9% were black, 6% were Hispanic, and 1 individual was an Asian Pacific Islander. There was not race or ethnicity information available for 141 officers. We were able to determine race and ethnicity for 126 officers. 122 of these officers used their firearms in the incident. So 82% were white, again, 11% were black, 6% Hispanic, 1% Asian Pacific Islander. And again, there was no race or ethnicity information available for 39 of the officers that used their firearm. 119 of the 122 officers that used their firearm were men, and 3 were females. The age of the officer, we were able to determine the age in a limited number of cases, but we did think it gave us a decent sample. The age of the officer was unknown in 70 of 119 incidents, but in the almost 50 incidents we had, the largest number of officers were between the age of 26 and 30, and you can see the chart there. Years of service for officers that used their firearm. We were able to determine years of service in the vast majority of cases. We couldn't determine it in 38 of 119 officers, but almost 40 of the officers involved who used their firearm in a deadly use of force incident had less than 5 years of service. And then again, 27 had between 6 and 10 years of service. So again, the vast majority of officers who used a firearm in a deadly use of force incident had fewer than 10 years of service. 10 officers of the officers we looked at were involved in more than one deadly use of force incident. There were 3 officers in Bridgeport who have been involved in multiple incidents, 1 officer in East Hartford, 3 in Norwich, and 1 in the Connecticut State Police. 2 officers were working for different departments during each incident. So there was an officer who worked in Manchester and Wethersfield, and an officer who worked in East Haven and the Connecticut State Police. Actually, that's not true. The 1 officer in East Haven was involved in both incidents in East Haven, and that's a correction I need to make in that presentation. 9 of the officers were involved in 2 incidents. So of the 10 that had been involved in more than 1, 9 were involved in 2. And 1 officer from Bridgeport has been involved in 3 incidents. 6 of the 10 officers used a firearm in all of the incidents they were involved in. 3 used a firearm in only 1 of the incidents they were involved in. And the 1 Bridgeport officer used their firearm in 2 of the 3 incidents they were involved in. The vast majority of incidents, officers only fired their weapon 1 time. So of the incidents, 27 incidents, the officer only fired their weapon once. And then you can see here There was one case where an officer fired their weapon as many as 19 times, but that was rare. Again, deadly use of force incidents have been investigated by the state's attorney within the different judicial districts. You can see the Hartford Judicial District has investigated the most deadly use of force incidents over the past 20 years. Charges, again, have only been filed in 3 of the 86 cases. One case in 2005, officer was charged with manslaughter and assault and was ultimately acquitted in 2009. In 2019, there was a correctional officer charged with 3rd-degree assault. And in 2019, there was a officer charged with 1st-degree assault and 2 counts of 1st-degree reckless endangerment. Those cases, I believe, are pending. We were only able to determine that discipline was imposed in 3 incidents. It's possible more, but from what we were able to determine from our research, the 2005 case, discipline was imposed. The officer retired and was ultimately awarded $350,000 in lost wages and legal fees. In 2011, there was an officer terminated by the department, but was later rehired. In 2019, there were 2 incidents, and again, the Hampton officer was terminated. The Wethersfield officer was disciplined for violating department pursuit policy, but later resigned. Civil lawsuits known to have been filed in at least 28 of the incidents. I believe this is the second to last slide. Video footage was available in at least 32 of the incidents. Dashboard camera was only available in 11 of the 86 incidents. Security surveillance was available in 16 incidents. Bystander footage in 3 incidents, body camera footage in 8 incidents, but we have seen a fairly substantial increase in body camera footage available as a result of these incidents, as you can see in recent years as body cameras have been implemented. So of the incidents in 2020, 55% had body camera footage available. That is sort of a high-level highlight of the data, and you can explore it in more detail if you wish on the website. But we do think that this exercise will really lead to a greater understanding, and the academic community will now have access to information to be able to further the science in understanding these incidents moving forward.
And just to thank you very much for that, I just wanted to respond to some of the questions in the chat. I think you answered the questions regarding the convictions. Another question was, were the 3 charges of the incidents of deadly force, or were they only out of the 18 involved unarmed subjects? So the charges are out of the complete data set. It's not limited to the 18 involving unarmed subjects. And then there was another.
Just to clarify, of the 3, there have only been 3 charges of all the incidents, but all 3 charges involved individuals that were unarmed. So that's where there might have been some confusion in my presentation.
Thank you. And then the other question was, did you cross-reference the race, ethnicity of the officers with the individuals involved?
We did not. That is available in the data set. But it's not something we did.
Good evening. I'll go ahead and get started. I want to thank the Connecticut Bar Association and the Connecticut Bar Foundation for inviting me to participate in this Constance Baker Motley series. Before I get started, I just want to share some information. We heard a little bit about Constance Baker Motley, and many of us know this rich history and legacy of the Honorable Constance Baker Motley, who was the first on so many fronts and levels. In the height of her civil rights movement, she joined the NAACP's legal team, the only woman in the group. She went to represent the NAACP in Southern courts, the first female Black lawyer Southern judges and juries had seen, and she stunned them by winning case after case after case. She went on to become the first Black woman New York State Senator, the first Black woman Manhattan Borough President, and with the backing of Lyndon Johnson, we all know she was the first Black woman named to federal judgeship. She helped right so many wrongs when it comes to racial inequality and racial inequities. in our country through the landmark cases she worked on, led, and won. Her cases, her work, her legacy were all hugely significant, groundbreaking, and life-changing. She opened so many doors and won over and over again. We stand on her shoulders, so it's important that I take some time to recognize her. She is truly an NAACP and civil rights icon. When I think about her courage, her brilliance, her dedication and commitment, especially with all the pushback, opposition, struggle, and racism that she and the others faced to achieve these wins, I am grateful that she kept pushing forward. None of that came easy, and it took years to see real change, progress, and advancement. Constance Baker Motley showed us the power of the law to affect real change. And she taught us to see what can be and what we can do. And that's what we're doing here in Connecticut. Knowing that she was from New Haven, she attended the same high school I attended, James Hillhouse High School. She attended the same church my grandparents attended, and our families knew each other well. She was a Black woman, of course, an NAACPer, an honorary member of my beloved Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority Incorporated, and so much more. This past September, on what would have been her 100th birthday, I took the time to go back and read some of this information just to remind myself of all the great things that she really was able to do in her time. I have a special connection to her, respect for her, and I honor her. Because she was deeply immersed in the Black freedom struggle and was a true warrior for justice, we now have so many doors open that we never had before. I was honored to meet her when she received the NAACP Spingarn Medal, the highest award the NAACP puts out, at our annual national convention in Miami. And what an honor it was to talk to her in person, to meet her, and to thank her for all of her work. She was so gracious that evening and so excited to see the delegation from New Haven, Connecticut. So I just wanted to take a little time to honor her. I draw strength and encouragement from her extraordinary life and legacy, and I just had to share a little bit about that experience. Thank you. In June 2020, when the task force was first formed, I knew very few people on the task force, nor did I really know what to expect or how big the commitment would be. But I knew if I wanted to see change, if I wanted to really see the police departments have accountability, it was important to be a part of the process. We started as a bigger group from various backgrounds, agencies, departments, expertise, and it was very diverse. And that was very impressive to me, and I hung in there. We all had an interest and passion around our thoughts, our suggestions, and what we thought police accountability should look like. The larger committee, as you heard earlier, decided the best way to address the various areas was to set up subcommittees. I was very pleased to co-chair with Mike Gustafson, who was the absolute best co-chair and really a rock star in this whole effort. Our committee, like all the other committees, was outstanding, hardworking, dedicated, knowledgeable, and committed to the process to really work this whole process of the task force through. Soon thereafter, the Connecticut legislators passed the HB 6004, and we know that that then became the Act Concerning Police Accountability, which became law on July 31st, 2020. Before that, and much further after that, the task force committee members all put in countless hours, time, work, and energy. And I applaud everyone who hung in there and really showed up faithfully every week to put in the work. We began to work in our subcommittees. Our oversight subcommittee then set up subcommittees. In addition to our weekly Friday morning meetings with the larger group, our committee met faithfully every Thursday morning for well over a year. And then our subcommittees met. So we put the time, the work and energy. And I think it's really important that people know how much research and effort went into this. We researched, we came up with what we felt was best practices and the best recommendations to help address and implement the various areas of this new law. We did not always agree. We asked the difficult questions. We offered suggestions, feedback, and when needed, we had to explain our positions. And we went back and forth. And sometimes this took weeks. This was not an easy process, but we always had respect for each other. And each member, every person, no matter what background they had or who they were representing or what position they had, everyone had the same opportunity to give feedback, input, and we listened to each other. We respected each other, and we got real work done. And I am proud of everything that we did. I feel that we came up with the best recommendations in our subcommittee, and we did bring them to the larger group. They were voted on. Sometimes they weren't. Sometimes we had to go back and tweak it again and go back again. So this was the process, but I think it was important work. The subcommittee I worked on specifically was the establishment of the civilian review boards. I worked along with Vern Riddick and Don McCauley Jr. But we, like all of our committee members, had equal access, opportunity to give our opinions, our feedback, and then we would go to the larger group. We certainly believe and know that the recommendations the Oversight Committee came up with are very practical, they're solid, and they will make a positive impact and a difference. Again, although I did not know many of the task force members when I came in, by the end, I have formed strong bonds. I have the highest respect and trust of the task force members, and that goes a long way. A few of them have called on me already, and I have reached out to them. I am now serving on a couple of committees that are led by some of our task force members. So the work we did together, not only was it important, meaningful, and impactful, it bridged an important gap that we needed. And I think we really got out of it much more than I expected, but I am grateful for it. The recommendations that the Oversight Committee worked on, and I'm not going to go into the data and all the information, everyone has the reports, but I will just highlight some of the work, some of the recommendations we made, and they were all passed and received and voted on. Modification of mandated accreditation standards, citizen complaint form and database, civilian review boards, mental health, which you already heard about, statute of limitations, pattern or practice, enforcement authority to the Attorney General, and use of force. I am proud of our members. I learned so much. I think they learned from me. We all took something together. Our work speaks for itself. The recommendations are there. I'm open to answering any questions, but I know that the work we did is solid. The recommendations we made are solid, practical, best practices. And that came from over a year and a half of really listening to each other, putting in the time, getting the proper research, and making sure we had what we felt is our best practices for Connecticut around oversight. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dory.
Thank you very much, Dory. Appreciate that and all your work on the committee. I think that Chief Mello is our next speaker.
Thank you, Deidre. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for the invitation here tonight. If you're wondering, if you've looked at the brochure and you're wondering where that man is that had the uniform and the hat on, he can't be here tonight. He's still in 2006 when the photo was taken, and so I apologize for the very dated and overly staged photo. But thank you again for inviting me here this evening. After George Floyd was killed, shortly after, I received a call from Deidre Daly, and she asked me to be a part of this group. And without hesitation, I accepted the invitation. I didn't really ask a lot of questions, but I knew that, and I was already deeply involved in work with the Post Council and work with the Legislative Task Force on transparency and accountability. And many of those were parallel tracks. But I knew that if Deidre Daly was organizing this work, this project, that it would be done in a way that was meaningful and likely impactful at the end, and could help myself and my colleagues evolve law enforcement and improve the profession. And I also knew that she would put together a group of talented men and women from a variety of experiences and perspectives. And she did just that. And so, Deidre, I want to thank you for the invitation to participate. I'm proud of the work, as I know we all are, over the last 18 months. And so thank you for your leadership. But I also want to thank the other members of the group for their commitment and their passion. While we didn't always agree, we nevertheless all listened and hopefully learned a lot, as Dory mentioned. And I appreciate all of you, and I'm grateful for the relationships that we've forged during this time. The report and the recommendations, I believe, that were released earlier today reflect the work and the consensus, and in some cases, just the simple majority opinion of the group. As others have stated, this work was truly collaborative and considerate of the opinions of all the participants, and respectful at all times. And so while we were able to reach a consensus on much, I do have to say that there are still some recommendations that I don't agree with, and I've made that known during the process, but not because the goal was noble, because it always was, either because, in my view, they were either unworkable or unsustainable, or already a duplication of what was already in place. Some of the recommendations or portions thereof were not necessarily directed towards legislation. They were more directed towards the Post Council, which is, for those that don't know, the Police Officers Standards and Training Council. And so some of those recommendations we've already put in place, and others we're still looking at to help guide us as we move forward. And so I'd like to talk about primarily two key areas that this committee assisted on, because I think that they really hit at the core of the issue when we're talking about policing. And those are the use of force and the accountability of police officers who commit misconduct and are unsuitable for law enforcement. I think those two areas, for me as a law enforcement professional, are areas that we have focused on and continue to focus on. And so I just want to talk about some of the work that we've done. Now, much of this work began years earlier. It certainly began before this task force was established. But nevertheless, we use this task force to help guide us through this process. And so I thank the members that participated on my subcommittee and on the overall task force, especially those that have had prior experience with dealing with these issues. On June 3rd, shortly after George Floyd was killed, the Post Council established a committee to develop a use of force policy, a statewide use of force policy. For those that don't know, in just about every state in the country, including Connecticut prior to this work, individual police departments would create a policy on use of force that was reflective of the state statute. We felt it was time that Connecticut went beyond that, and we had been studying this issue for quite some time, looking at what had happened in California and in Utah and a few other places. And so on June 3rd, the Post Council voted to establish this committee that would reflect best practices of law enforcement, but also reflect what our goals, the goals of Connecticut law enforcement, and then later reflect the goals of the police accountability bill that was passed a few months later. And so to do this, we thought it was best to engage national experts, and we have some national experts right here in Connecticut. And so included in this committee were Professor Tracy Mears from Yale and the Justice Collaboratory. As many of you know, Professor Mears was part of President Obama's 21st Century Task Force on Policing. And she's done some important work in this area of police accountability, of use of force, and oversight of large city police departments. Dr. Amy Donahue formerly professor of public policy at UConn and now the provost at the United States Coast Guard Academy. Professor Jim McCabe of the Sacred Heart University, and formerly the director of the NYPD Training Academy, and has also done quite a bit of work on developing policy and training programs as part of federal oversight programs. Attorney Elliot Spector, attorney and former police chief and chair of the post consul Dwayne Lavello, attorney, former FBI special agent, former head of the state police, and current police chief Rick Fox, and a number of others. This committee worked diligently for 6 months to develop this policy that would be a policy that would be required and mandated of all Connecticut police departments. We thought it was important that all police departments operate off the same sheet of music, a feeling that was supported by this task force. That work took about 6 months. And in that work, we further defined the requirements, or excuse me, the new legal standard in the Police Accountability Bill, which is, in my view, the most restrictive use of force law and use of force policy in the entire country. In fact, Connecticut has departed from a long-established standard on the use of force, a standard that is still in effect with federal law enforcement as well. The new standard put restrictions on when force can be used, and it also looked at the idea of justified versus necessary. And when Ken Barone was talking about data, he had mentioned before about the word justified. I think Deidre may have mentioned it as well. Justifiable under the law. Well, we felt that really wasn't enough. And so we looked at the term necessary. And so we worked with the legislature as they passed the Police Accountability Bill and Section 29, the use of force. We wanted to make sure that police officers were only using force, especially deadly force, when it was absolutely necessary. And that when all other reasonable alternatives were reasonably considered. And it wasn't enough just to determine whether or not it fit the legal standard. Using the old adage, just because you could doesn't mean that you should, or in this case, that you have to. We also introduced some new terms, last resort, proportional use of force, officer-created jeopardy. And so when we looked at use of force, we also thought it was important to look at the conduct of the officer leading up to the use of force. In other words, incidents where the officer needlessly and recklessly placed himself or herself in a position where deadly force would have to be used. We placed a greater emphasis on de-escalation and on those skills. Now, none of this is new. De-escalation certainly isn't new. We've been teaching de-escalation for over a decade. But we felt a renewed emphasis, and to make sure that we operated off the same sheet of music, that every officer was operating under the same policy. And so we took it one step further and we developed a training program. So after the first 6 months was phase one, we developed the training, we developed a policy, followed by a training program. And we looked at training programs around the country. We primarily looked at training programs that were developed as a result of federal oversight. Baltimore was one example. And we developed a training program that we think is the best in the nation. And so not only would police officers be operating off the same policy, and departments are no longer free to develop their own policy and interpret state law. We've done that for them. We now have a training program that all police officers will be trained without modification. We're in the process of rolling that out. It's a monumental task. We're trying to train nearly 9,000 police officers in the state by July 1st. We focus on such things as the banning of chokeholds in all situations except for deadly force situations, the duty to intervene, the duty to render aid, and the duty to report. Our use of force training is complemented by individual training such as de-escalation and other use of force related subjects. All of those will have a component of a de-escalation piece. We felt that this is transformative in the sense that it changes the mindset. It changes the mindset where people start to think about not only if you do this, how should I respond? It focuses on a mindset that talks about and reinforces the response should only be as a last resort and only when absolutely necessary. And you may find it interesting. I've sat in a number of training classes, and most police officers, not all, but most police officers walked away and said, what's different? What changed? Okay, the legal standards changed. We're now criminally liable for more than we were before. But in terms of operationally, what's really changed, because as I remind officers, there's very few officers, especially experienced officers, that can sit in a classroom and answer no to this question. How many officers have ever been in a situation where they were probably justified in the law to use deadly force, but they didn't, because they de-escalated or they used other alternative measures? And most of them agree that they have always practiced these skills. But we think this is transformative. We're proud of it. And I want to thank this task force for the work that they did in allowing me to use them as my guide as we went through this and ran some of these things primarily through our subcommittee. And the other thing I want to talk about is the decertification process. For those that don't know, the Police Officer Standard and Training Council, or Post Council, provides oversight on training, curriculum, accreditation, standards, and in some cases, as the statutes permit, policy. And so that's a pretty broad area. But one of the areas on certification was the decertification, the authority to decertify officers. In other words, to take their license away. So when a police officer is hired, they complete their training, they become certified, and then they have to recertify every 3 years after they fulfill some mandated training requirements set by post. And so when we looked at the area of accountability, we know that there are times where police officers have been disciplined for misconduct, and either it results in a negotiated settlement because of a grievance, or perhaps on occasion the discipline is overturned as being too severe, especially when it comes in the area of termination. So police chiefs reported that we were guided by decisions by the labor board, and at the same time felt that there were still men and women who were not suitable for the job. Maybe they shouldn't lose their job, but were not suitable to police. And so how do we address that? And so we met with the legislature and we introduced the decertification process. Now, we already had decertification, but we added to that additional qualifying offenses that police departments, that police chiefs can report to post council, and through a due process, a licensing process, could potentially take the certification, revoke the certification from a police officer permanently or temporarily. Now, that doesn't address whether that officer will still maintain his or her job. That's not the work of the council. That's up to the labor process within the individual municipality or the state. And so we developed a set of criteria, and we being the council, we further defined that. And I thank the task force for their help in establishing those areas. Many of those areas were in the statute as we worked with the legislation or with the legislators. And so we established criteria that a police officer could be decertified or the certification could be revoked. And we also created areas of mandatory report where police departments did not have a choice. And those centered around illegal, excessive, or unreasonable use of force, or the failure to intervene when force was illegal, unnecessary, or unreasonable, as known by the police officer. And so we thought it was important to focus on those areas around force and around the failure to intervene. And we also focused on a mandatory reporting requirement for issues of bias-related incidents that result in injury. I'm not going to spend a lot of time going through the decertification policy or the use of force policy, but I will direct you to the Post Council website. It's the Connecticut State website. If you Google Post Connecticut, you'll find it. And I invite you to take a look at that decertification program and policy and the new use of force policy as well. And so a couple areas too, before I turn it over to the next speaker, regarding training. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on training, but I know when you look in the recommendations, you'll see recommendations about bias training. I do want everyone to know that the state of Connecticut, that we have been providing bias training, fair and impartial policing training for over a decade. It's some of the most robust training that we have in terms of committing limited resources to this type of training. Now, we can argue whether that training is truly effective. What we have done and what has been guided by this task force is the increase in the hours and the additional courses of anti-racism. And we've also established a criminal justice seminar where police recruits will now spend 3 days studying topics that are related to social justice, cultural diversity and awareness, procedural justice, and the like. And included in that is a community forum. It's 1 full day of hearing from men and women and representatives from those that have been impacted by the criminal justice system. And so I thank the task force for the work that they've done to help establish that. And finally, another recommendation that was guided by this task force, and you'll see it as a recommendation 19, I believe. And I believe it's the Racial Justice Working Group. We have established being the post council, a standing committee, and we've titled that the Social Justice Advisory Committee. And that group, which is made up of 18 men and women representing a number of social justice advocacy groups, the clergy, and some representatives from law enforcement. And I'm also proud, and I think Dory may have alluded to this, that there are 3 members of this task force that have agreed to sit on that committee. And that committee will make recommendations to the post council on all matters of social justice as it relates to training and policy and standards, both of agencies and of police officers, including hiring and recruiting standards. So our goal is to vet our work through that committee. So I'm really excited about that committee. I thank you for the recommendation. We tried to use a lot of the language that was established by the subcommittee. And so thank you for that. And with that, I don't want to take any more time, and I'd be happy to entertain questions after the final speaker has spoken. Thank you.
Thank you, Chief Mello. Appreciate that. And I think we're now going to hear from Alexis.
Thank you, Deirdre. Thank you, Chief Mello. Good evening, everyone. My name is Alexis Smith. It's really great to be here. I was really kind of honored to be a part of this task force over the last 18, 19 months. I will say personally, it was a huge learning curve for me. I had not had much experience at all with law enforcement or policing. And so I learned a lot, really had to dive into a lot of thinking and learning, and I really appreciate everyone's patience. So I'll tell you a little bit about our subcommittee, and it's called Moral Recognition, as Deirdre said when she introduced the subcommittee. And I think it's really important to spend a little time talking about the people who are on our committee, because that's really what guided our work and really what grounded us. Their experiences, their perspectives helped to shape how we moved forward with our recommendations. So Troy Brown, Cecil Thomas, Preston Tisdale, Kitty Tyrell, and Maya Donald are all members of our committee. And so if you look at the experiences of everyone, we had community organizing. So we had someone who could give us the perspective of what it's like to bring people together, what it's like to advocate for people who have felt they've been wronged and felt that they have been victimized. We had some really extensive training background, right? We have some expert trainers on our committee who focus their work on training lots of different people across many sectors in cultural awareness, bias, anti-racism, and racial justice. We had someone who has spent many, many years of their career working in the context of reforming the criminal justice system, whether it's in the context of jury selection or the public defender system. And then we had legal aid lawyers who I think work at the intersection of the criminal justice system and the civil legal aid system, where we are working on behalf of people whose criminal convictions impact so many things on the civil side of their work. And so they may be people whose criminal conviction has prevented them from getting housing, prevented them from getting employment, but also impacts their ability to call the police when they're in trouble and when they're in danger, based on their experience. So all of that guided our work. And where we landed in terms of the scope of our work is we really wanted to look at the history of policing and how that has impacted communities for centuries. And so we rooted our work in a truth and reconciliation model. And so if you're not familiar with truth and reconciliation, probably the best example that exists in our history is looking at South Africa at the end of apartheid. And so there was a Truth and Reconciliation Commission established to essentially allow victims who had been victims of significant human rights abuses to tell their stories and to face their perpetrators, and to allow really deep listening and really strong connection so that South Africa could affect change, that people could really listen to one another and allow stories to be told. And so that was the model that we really wanted to use. And I want to share with you one thing that Bishop Desmond Tutu said in the process of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa. True reconciliation exposes the awfulness, the abuse, the hurt, the truth. It could take even, sometimes it could even make things worse. It is a risky undertaking, but in the end it is worthwhile, because in the end, only an honest confrontation with reality can bring real healing. Superficial reconciliation can only bring superficial healing. So we know that these conversations are difficult. We know this is really hard work, but I think if there's one thing that all of us have learned over the last 19 months is that if we come together with a common goal and we are civil and we can really discourse, we can really accomplish anything. So the actual scope of our work was really rooted in an acknowledgement that there are deep historical distrusts among African Americans, people of color, and their communities. What we wanted to really accomplish is acknowledging and letting police departments use our recommendations to repair these relationships and really strengthen them. We really looked at how ways to create an opportunity for police departments to learn about, discuss, and address the root causes of the present and historic distrust. So, like I said, we know these conversations are difficult, and one of the things that we really wanted is to provide degrees of support to both police departments and to Post. And Chief Mello outlined the Post Council and their work, and we appreciate Chief Mello's work with us in providing us a lot of documentation, and I know that was a huge lift for you. But we really dove into what the current curriculum is that Post provides, the current trainings that they provide. And I think one thing that was a theme for us, and it came up in other subcommittees, and I know it's come up at the state level, whether it's the legislation or the state task force, is this idea of uniformity and this concept of wanting to do things the same across all departments around Connecticut. Because we do find that there are some inconsistencies, whether it's, with respect to training, ongoing, right? So once a police officer becomes a police officer, what's the training that they receive on an annual basis, every 5 years, every 10 years? And so we wanted to really focus on that and make that uniform. So one of the things that Chief Mello mentioned is one of our recommendations was to establish a racial justice working group that would help guide that work and provide support to departments, provide support to the Post Council. And he very graciously instituted that. It was probably the easiest implementation of a recommendation that we could hope for. And I think the other key thing that I would say about the Racial Justice Working Group is that we really wanted to make it representative. We didn't feel that it would accomplish the goals of just making, if it was just law enforcement or just community members or just lawyers, but it really had to be a diverse group of people coming together with many voices at the table. And so that was appreciated. One other theme that came up a lot during our conversations, I would capture as engaging the community. So we were really, really concerned and focused on making sure that community members had the opportunity to provide feedback, to engage with community, engage with law enforcement in ways that, again, told their stories, that allowed people to talked to law enforcement in ways that really showed that this is how your actions are impacting us, and this is how your actions are impacting our families. And so we spent a lot of time talking about that. And there actually are a couple of models around the country that allow communities to engage in surveys and follow up with community forums with law enforcement. And so that was another recommendation that we really dove into. And again, understanding that this would need support and that these were huge lifts, we were looking to the Racial Justice Working Group to kind of help coordinate some of these things. The other theme, and it was really kind of a function of the makeup of our committee, you can't spend time with Troy and Cecil and Kitty and not talk about training, because that is just in their DNA. And so we spent a lot of time talking about professional development and training for police officers, again, with the eye of what can we do what can we implement that's consistent and across the board and ongoing. And I think one thing that I've learned from the three of them is when we talk about bias training, when we talk about anti-racism, when we talk about cultural awareness, is that these are things that really are practices and they're behaviors, and you've got to do them over and over and over again. So it's one thing to have this training offered at the academy level, but it's a whole nother thing to say we are committed to doing X amount of hours each year, every year for all officers. And I think that's really where we wanted to get to. Another part of our recommendation, again, on the support end, was at the post level to have an individual that would be a diversity, equity, and inclusion coordinator. Again, to sort of establish this uniformity of training and professional development, but someone who had a background in DEI, someone who had a background in developing curriculum, someone who would help coordinate the community forums and engaging and making those connections. So that essentially is where we ended up. It was to talk a little bit about our process. We also met weekly. We usually met on Thursdays throughout the life of the task force. We even met for a little bit after the task force work was complete, even though a lot of times we didn't have anything to really talk about and not an agenda. We had just grown so accustomed to meeting and really enjoyed being with one another. But I do want to, again, recognize Chief Mello for his help in giving us resources, and also people within the post council office who he connected us with as well. And Ken Barone also, who attended a couple of our meetings and provided additional support. So that was our committee.
Thank you so much, Alexis, and for all your work on our task force as well. Much, much appreciated. And our final speaker is Keith King, Reverend Keith King.
All right. Good evening, everyone. I think we have a hard stop in 5 minutes or so, but I do want to quickly
Keith, I think it's till 7.
Oh, till 7. Okay, yeah. Very well. I do want to thank Deidre for leading the effort, even though we are, the three of us are chairs. Deidre really led the effort and kept everyone on task. I also want to thank Chief Mello and Chief Riddick for their invaluable insight. It really was very enlightening to work with them and to hear their perspective and to share our perspective. So really do want to acknowledge them. And want to also acknowledge the subcommittee, Reimagining Police Subcommittee, who worked hard. Some were on both the overall task force and had to meet a couple of times a week. Dr. Maisa Akbar was the co-chair of the Reimagining Committee, and she and Skip and our PhD students, Matthew and Damar, really led the mental health discussion of the community and how the police can engage with those dealing with mental health. Also, Maggie and Patrick Cooney dealt with the hiring and promotion review boards. And Charles Grady, as I'll talk about in a minute, was really the architect of the community and culture recommendation. And there were a number of supporting casts. Teresa Hopkins Staton also worked with the economic subcommittee. Skip Mashback, a good friend, led the effort with respect to mobile crisis teams. And you all hear my dog in the back. Apologize for that. And also the 988 recommendation. Arthur Thomas, who is Director of Entrepreneurial Initiatives and Inclusive Economic Opportunities at the New Haven Community Foundation, led the economic recommendation along with Gwen Samuels and Teresa, and Alan Bowie Jr. Was the other committee member. So to give time to for a discussion, and hopefully there will be a lot of questions at the end. The Reimagining subcommittee dealt with really pragmatic ways to deal with police interaction with the public. Our first recommendation is one that that was supported by the police departments, and also in the police accountability bill. Recommendation number 20 is the feasibility study on the use of social workers in mobile crisis units. The police were very supportive of that. Many of you know it's the concept of allowing social workers to either go with police who may encounter someone having a mental health crisis or homeless or addiction. And so that was something that we thought Connecticut should try to implement as soon as possible to reduce the lethality of police shootings, particularly in regards to those dealing with mental health, homelessness, or addictions. This is a very popular recommendation overall. It is supported by the Department of Justice, and it's also supported by former President Trump and President Biden. And so there was in the police accountability bill a recommendation or requirement that police departments submit a feasibility study, and those studies I think went to post and they're being looked at, but that's one of our recommendations. Again, that the police should not be always called to deal with mental health, people in a mental health crisis. Many of the people on the task force know that there is a popular motto out of Eugene, Oregon called Cahoots. And that motto, only 3% of the cases or calls that they received involve police. So a very promising motto. Recommendation number 21 from the Reimagining Police involves creation of a municipal civilian interview panels and a community cops and culture exchange program. Really the ideal of that is to have the community involved in the hiring and promotion of police. And that is really for reasons that should be apparent, just to remind police sometimes who don't live in the city that they serve, that they are responsible to the citizens of that community. And so the community would be involved in the hiring and their promotions. We thought that we were thinking outside of the box, but on a lot of this, Obama's 21st Century Police Reform and Police actually recommended those things as well. Attached to recommendation 21 is Community Cops and Culture Exchange Program. Really, Grady, who was a Hamden Police, worked in the U.S. Attorney's Office for a while and now is with the U.S. Attorney's Office. The concept there is to have police recruits be involved in an exchange program where they would work with diverse police recruits and also in diverse communities to build relationships, but also to flag if there are reasons to have concerns about perhaps their biases. biases. So that is recommendation number 21 from our report. The report is there for everyone to read. So I will summarize our work. And recommendation number 22, we're really excited about this. This is the implementation of a federally mandated 988 crisis hotline and an expansion and to expand it so it includes behavioral health crisis response. It initially was signed into law to deal with suicide prevention. It allows, let me just quickly read, legislation implementing the federal mandate 988 crisis hotline has already been introduced and passed and signed into law in 18 states. We propose a recommendation that the General Assembly enact legislation in the form that aligns with the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, the model bill published by the National Association of Mental Health and Program Directors, which reflect the robust approaches reflected in the bill passed in Washington State and introduced in New York State. Essentially, there is federal legislation mandating that all 50 states establish a 988 call to deal with not only suicide, but mental health in general. And the beauty of the legislation, it includes in that a funding mechanism on cell phones. And so that money could be used to provide services for people in a mental health crisis, homelessness, addictions. And so we believe that Connecticut should implement that 988 mechanism as soon as possible. Many people will remember that Connecticut is ahead of the game. We already have a 211 line dealing with this, but as we had several conversations with United Way, it is under resourced. And so this is a way to resource all of the various needs related to mental health and homelessness and a variety of other issues. The last recommendation by Reimagining Police deals with not the police necessarily, but the community itself. And we're recommending $300 million be invested into under-resourced communities to help them gain economic mobility and to deal with education, jobs, and adequate health care, because we believe that the police obviously can't do it alone. We need to try to create healthier communities. The economic recommendation goes back. Many people have read the Kerner report in 1968. The president put together a bipartisan committee, and former Governor Kerner led that committee. But essentially, the committee concluded that the riots of the 60s or some version thereof will continue to happen until we invest in the inner cities and we do something to address systemic inequality. And so we believe that the savings from the decrease in prison population in Connecticut could serve as an initial investment into the inner cities. So in a nutshell, that is really the work of the Reimagining Committee. And I'm open to questions from anyone who might have.
Thank you very much, Keith. Appreciate that. We're now at the place where we can take questions. There are a few questions on the chat that I think are still unanswered. One is, please repost a link to the report. We can definitely handle that one. So that will be posted and the CBA will help there. One question that has to do with training, and I was just chatting with Alexis to see if any of our trainers were at this conference. I don't know if Troy is on, but I understand that Kitty may be on. So I'll pose the question and see if either of them are available and interested in responding to this question, which is the following. Is there a way to measure whether or not the police officers who receive bias training own it? And the concern was that, you know, young officers might just shrug it off as political correctness, but not something meaningful. I wondered if anyone on the panel or on the call who has some training experience who would like to respond to that.
Deirdre, I could weigh in on some of the science around
Thank
implicit
you.
bias training. There has been a lot of research, particularly in the last 5 to 8 years, on the impact of implicit bias training. What the researchers largely told us with regards to policing is that when implicit bias training is integrated into the other trainings that police do routinely, and when it is scenario based, it tends to be more effective than simply sitting officers in a classroom for 6 to 8 hours to talk about implicit bias. In fact, a lot of the research about, say, fair and impartial policing, which is an implicit bias program that we do use here in Connecticut, show that, you know, it doesn't necessarily have any negative impact, but it doesn't have as great of a return on investment as we may have hoped. But we have seen, again, the scenario-based hands-on training for law enforcement that incorporates implicit bias into that training is much more effective than sort of a static training for police. So there are tools to measure it. Lots of researchers are out there trying to measure the effectiveness and impact of implicit bias training. And because it's such a growing field, I think the research in the field is only going to keep growing in the future.
Thanks very much for that, Ken. Very helpful and responsive to this question. Appreciate that. There's one other question here, which I think probably goes to reimagining. And here's the question. Was there any discussion of engaging with peers to respond to people in crisis and to talk more about supporting voluntary engagement with services rather than co-responder models that still very often bring people to the ED, emergency department, involuntarily? So super interesting question. I don't know. I don't think that's part of any of our recommendations, but wondered if Keith or anyone else has any commentary about that.
Yeah, there were peer models out there, so we did have discussions about the peer models, but we felt that a number of police departments were more familiar with co-responders model, and so we kind of supported that, but we did look at the peer model as well, so we did have some discussions about it.
Thanks. And Chief Mello, did you want to elaborate there?
Sure. So I think when there are a number of models out there, and while most police departments favor a co-responder model, they do so for the reasons of safety. But I think as this starts to really take off, I know I'll use Milford, for instance. We are using rescue funds to hire 2 full-time licensed clinical social workers, and we've recently taken on 2 graduate students as interns. So we'll have 4 folks that are going to help with this program. And the goal here is to start with a co-responder model. Well, actually to start with a referral model and then work on a co-responder model. But the overall goal is to allow, whether there are employees or whether we contract with someone else, to respond to these calls separately. So I think that's something that many, maybe most law enforcement agencies support, but it begins with the triage that comes into the 911 center. You know, we do have a 211 system, but it's not robust enough where folks can kind of self-diagnose and say, look, I don't want law enforcement here. I need a mental health professional. There's some triage is still required to make sure that there's not an active threat. So I think that that's the first thing we need to do is start to stand up our dispatch centers to the point where, provided it's supported by our local officials, to bring in mental health professionals that can triage these calls in a meaningful way and then determine whether a co-responder model is appropriate or a response by mental health professionals. It's something that I think a lot of chiefs support, something I certainly support. But I also do want to just comment regarding involuntary transport to the ED. Most of that is using our authority when somebody has threatened suicide. And that is when someone doesn't want to go to the hospital. If we think they're harmful to themselves or they're potentially suicidal, we're going to bring them there. The last thing that we want to do is engage anyone with any type of force that doesn't want to comply. We strongly endorse, whether it be co-responders or whether it be a single response, the use of folks that can hopefully have a stronger skill set when it talks to dealing with people that have mental health issues, people that are suicidal, people that are homeless. So again, in summary, those are areas that we hope will evolve. But I also want to make clear that there will always, unfortunately, be those that have to be forced to the ED just to keep them safe.
So a couple more questions here. One, I think, Chief, you've already answered, but just for the rest of the group, another question was, how would one determine whether engaging with mobile emergency responders would be placing non-law enforcement at too great a risk? And I think you've responded to that, so thank you there. Another question here about the data. Any idea about the reasons for the large disparities between the use of deadly force in some police departments of the same size? So this, and Ken can speak to this as well, but this is something we've talked about a lot. Hartford has certainly had significant violent crime challenges, and that may be one of the reasons that the numbers there are higher. But it certainly is very interesting to look at Hartford versus New Haven versus Bridgeport, because New Haven has a much, much lower number. I think it's 3 versus a Hartford that has 11, and Bridgeport is somewhere in between at 7. And these are cities that are relatively similar demographically and face a lot of the same challenges. So it's a really interesting question, and I think it probably deserves a panel of its own with some expert analysis. I have some ad hoc views, but I don't think I have any formal answers. But I wanted to give Ken a chance to respond as well to that.
I'd agree with what Deirdre said. I think at this point, the reasons for the discrepancy would be largely speculation. There's certainly a number of, I think, questions that need to be further answered. I know, just as an example, the city of New Haven has been engaged in the project longevity problem longer than the other 2 major cities, Hartford and Bridgeport. That's certainly something, right, that I think researchers should be exploring. Questions that we asked and at this point we're unable to answer, but that I think should be the Hartford Police Department should engage in a conversation on is, the use of certain tactical teams, and right, are there differences across agencies and in the formation of the department, special units that they might have. I think those are all questions that need to be answered, as well as understanding the impact that violent crime and the police department's reaction to violent crime has. So at this point, many more questions than answers, but I do think the fact that Hartford has seen almost twice as many deadly use of force incidents in the last 20 years as Bridgeport, and you're talking a difference of 10 more incidents in Hartford than in New Haven. It's certainly something worth exploring.
And yeah, just to echo further on that, Ken, I do think the community policing model, based on my experience in Connecticut, is very rooted in New Haven for a long time. And that may be one reason why New Haven has a better record in this area. It is also true, as Ken says, that there is a non-violence initiative known as Project Longevity, which is most rooted in New Haven as compared to the other 2 cities. And it involves reaching out to gang members and offering them services, and also telling them that the violence has to stop. And if it doesn't stop, that their gang will be focused on. And I think that evidence has showed in Connecticut and also in other states that that model can be very impactful. So there are a few other questions here. Let's see. Was there any discussion on protecting our medical first responders transporting a disturbed individual? Chief, I think that'll be your question.
No, we haven't. That wasn't something that we examined.
Okay. Somebody else is just being complimentary here. I don't think there's a question there. Here are two other questions, which I think are very interesting. I think this first one is also for the chief. How do the panelists think rank and file police officers will react to the recommendations?
Well, it's a difficult time to be a law enforcement officer. You know, and we're often demonized. That's kind of new for us. Many of us felt like we left our house on one May morning as a hero, and those that work hard to keep others safe, and came home somewhat of a demon or a pariah, and so that's been difficult. And it has. I watched tapes of officers interacting with the public, and they're going through a lot of abuse, verbal abuse, in some cases physical abuse, and we're finding it much more difficult to get folks to comply with us. Officers have been reluctant in some cases, in many cases, quite honestly, to engage. And so they will. It's a raw time for police officers, and I'm not sure if we're ready even to talk about that yet, but it is, and we see that with the fact that we can't get anyone to do this job, or we're having trouble recruiting, I should say. Now, how much of that is a result of the labor shortage is yet to be seen, and so we're having trouble recruiting and retaining and keeping officers engaged. But that's our job. That's my job, to make sure that we do that, and officers continue to do their job, and I have every confidence that they will. I do think that there's some areas that they'll look at in this report and appreciate, and I think that it'll guide police departments, as Alexis had mentioned. But there are some areas that they will see as being potentially overly critical and unnecessary. And quite honestly, my comments that I made in the beginning of my remarks were directed at them, because we've made those known during these deliberations, and I know that my colleagues recall that. But I do think that there is much to be proud of here, and I think that police officers are going through a transformative time as well, and that's not a bad thing.
Thank you, Chief. So just to follow up on that point, and also another question posed here, and there's a few more questions we'll address too. We do want to get the word out more broadly here about the report and speak to interested stakeholders. So we're going to go to the Post Council. We may be going to some legislative bodies. Alexis and Keith are working on having some listening tours with community groups. And we're considering other things as well. So if you have a group that you think would be interested in hearing from some subset of us, it can be some subset of this group, but there's also a broader task force behind us that is also available. So feel free to email any of us or the CBA through Amani, and we'll follow up on that. But I also wanted to pose the other questions here. So one question is, can you comment on the future of the recommendations? For example, those that require legislation to implement. Have you determined the natural advocates and lobbyists and leaders that will move this forward? So I may not have been completely clear about this earlier, but with Ken's help, because he's also on the legislative task force, all of these recommendations have been presented to that task force. And that task force has considered them all and has referred a number of them to the legislature. some of which the legislature has passed already, some of which the legislature is considering. But Ken, you may have more to add on that point.
No, I think that the work that's been done by the CBA task force, you'll notice if you read those 22 recommendations that a handful of them already helped to shape legislation last session. Some of the reforms to the IG Inspector General position were put into law already, and that conversation largely started with the CBA task force. So there's been movement on a number of these recommendations already. All of the recommendations have been presented to the task force created by the Connecticut General Assembly. And I think it's our hope that the report will be presented to both the Judiciary and Public Safety Committees, and that it will be a document used to guide policy development in the years to come. Some of these recommendations aren't sort of quick fixes. They're not overnight policy recommendations. They can't be implemented even if passed into law in one session. So hopefully it's a document that people keep referring back to in a similar fashion that most people that have been doing this work for a while have used President Obama's 21st century task force report on policing as a foundation for the conversation since that report came out, I think in 2015. So hopefully this report can be used to guide work in the years to come. And at the end of the day, I don't want to speak for CBA. I don't know how much advocating CBA does as much as this is the product. They've explained their process. It's been a very deliberate and thoughtful process, and they'll present that document to folks that want to learn more about it. But it's up to other folks to determine, I think, how much of that gets acted on in law. At least that's my understanding.
Yeah, and can I just add to that really quickly? I mean, I think, I said at the beginning of my presentation that I'm new to this work, and I think it's important that we acknowledge, the number of people who have been, doing this and engaged in this for a really long time. Some of whom were on our task force, and some of whom, are not. And so I think part of that question asks, how are we going to engage, some of those individuals and others who may be interested, in shepherding, this movement along as we go.
Thank you, Alexis and Ken. There was another question. I know the answer to this, but it's a good question, so I wanted to pose it. Were any combat commanders, infantry or armor from Iraq or Afghanistan on the committee for different views, especially with training in ROE? They were not, I don't think, but that's a good point, and something we can all take into consideration. I don't know if anyone else has any comments about that. Okay, and someone else asked that we please mention the benefit of street outreach community workers in Hartford and New Haven, who deal so effectively with 16 to the 25-year-olds with in under-resourced areas. Very good point. We had somebody on our panel who does some of that, on our task force who does some of that work, who was very vocal and very much a participant. I'm not sure if he's on the at this webinar right now, but we did hear from him and are very much aware of that very important and very difficult work. So thank you for raising that.
Shout out to Warren
somebody
Hardy.
else. That was Warren Hardy, right?
Warren Hardy, and he stayed with us from the beginning to the end and definitely used his voice and shared his experiences ongoing.
Thank you, Dory. And a good point. There are also community outreach workers very much present and active in Bridgeport. Appreciate all their contributions as well. I think I covered what's in the chats, but does anyone else on the panel or anyone else in the audience have any other comments, thoughts, or questions? We're rounding up to the 7 o'clock hour, so our timing's good, but we have a few more minutes if anyone else would like to speak or pose a question.
Deirdre, this is Karen. If I can add, I am completely impressed about around the ways in which you all seem to have honored the power of your individual narratives and stories, and how you came into this work, whether it's new or whether it's longstanding. And I think from my perspective and the work that I do, that really creates a nice relationship, right? Dory said this in the beginning, the ways in which she has not been connected to the CBA or CBF in this type of way, but creating relationships gives us the ability to really move forward and to hear each other's perspectives and comments. And I commend you and Alexis and Pastor Keith, Reverend Keith, for the work that you've done in co-chairing this committee. Obviously, Nadidi Moses for starting the committee. All of you who have lent your expertise and your voice and your volunteer hours to this task force. And I really want to thank you all for participating today.
Thank you, Karen. And of course, I've just now uncovered several more questions that we're not going to be able to answer, but I'd like to read them just so that those of us that are continuing to work on this have them in our minds. One is, did your task force have input from police chiefs or deputies from the largest cities? Hartford, Bridgeport, New Haven, Waterbury, Stamford, or New London? The chief of New Haven was on the task force, and we had quite a bit of, for some period of time in the beginning. He then left the department, but he did definitely give us significant input. We did not do interviews or have direct communications with the other chiefs that you mentioned, but we're certainly happy to do that. And we're talking to Chief Mello and others about possibilities of having a meeting like this or some other kind of meeting with police chiefs. Another question is, will some or all the recommendations require collective bargaining with police unions? That's over my pay grade. What's the answer to that, Chief?
Some will, certainly some will. And I think we've talked about that in subcommittee work, especially as it involves civilians and promotions, and there's a few other areas, so some will.
Thank you. Was there any data developed around officers coming from military background versus other backgrounds?
That wasn't an area we explored.
Yeah, we didn't explore that. I don't think we have access to that information, right, Ken?
Correct. We had limited officer information available to us.
Okay. Are there any plans to engage trainers to assist in conveying the contents of the report and the recommendations to our police officers? Interesting idea. We haven't done anything about that, but we're still digesting and thinking about ways to communicate our findings. But Alexis, do you have any other thoughts on that?
I mean, I think that's an interesting idea. I mean, I think the communication will be critical. You know, how this is all conveyed. So, you know, whether that's a trainer or someone with a kind of specific, in a specific profession or with a specific skill set, I think will be important.
Thank you. Here's two more quick comments. There's been quite a bit of pushback against the police accountability bill, especially around juvenile crime. Will this task force continue to be involved in these discussions moving forward and in shaping any future legislation that may come out of that pushback? I think some of that's to be determined. I do think that we very much want to speak with legislators, and perhaps the Judiciary Committee, about our recommendations. And so we certainly will be engaged at a minimum to that level, and perhaps further. And then there's one administrative question. Does anyone know what a Zoom user ID is? I don't know.
That is the email address that you used to join today, or the telephone number you used to join.
Terrific. Thank you, Tom. All right, 7:01, not bad. Thank you very much for coming. Thank everybody for all their hard work here. Thanks very much for the large turnout. And if you have want to communicate with us further, please reach out. We'd be happy to hear from you.
Thank you again.
Have a good night.
Thanks to our panelists. Please follow the Connecticut Bar Association and the Connecticut Bar Foundation for a listing of all of our future events. In the spring of 22, we will have conversations around critical race theory, health and equity, educational disparities, and diversity, equity, and inclusion in the legal profession. Thank you all again for your time and attention. I appreciate it. Have a great night.